class, today's lecture, if you will, the lesson, we are going to talk about some additional literary elements which we especially are focusing on this semester, sort of in the addition to what we had at the beginning of the semester, since we are engaging more and more with literary texts. And what we start from is a technique of framing in the literature, since we had one example last week in the seminar class with the House of Asterion, and we'll come back to that example today during the lecture. And we are going to have another example of a framed story next week, because we are going to be reading a passage from The Wuthering Heights. And that one's going to be actually included in the lecture today. Also, the lecture itself contains a list of various types of examples of all the techniques that we are going to be discussing, so that you can have that later for reference, and hopefully at least some of those outside of the ones that we are going to be talking about are also going to be familiar. So, okay, we'll see how that goes when we get to that. So the concept that we are starting from is a frame. And as the name of the term itself sort of suggests, a frame is going to be some kind of a piece of a textual structure that holds something else inside. And like, it's very common in literature, you know, it's also very common in theater, and also in movie screenplays, like this situation where you have a character that, for example, tells the story from his own perspective and like starts off in first person, and then actually you get another story within that one where you, for example, go back in time, or the character remembers something from the past, and then the story which is on the inside, like the inside part of the narrative, actually involves from a different narrative perspective. So generally, that's what frames are, like these outside stories which literally do function as frames, so to frame something else that is going to come later as a part of the full narrative. So a narrative then is, as it says here, a story introducing or containing one or more other stories. And the primary focus will be on the frame story, but the focus also may shift as the story goes on, or as the story actually takes place. If we want to define it, we usually call it a story within a story. Okay, so a frame story, which is also known as a frame tale or a frame narrative, is a literary technique which serves as a companion piece to a story within a story, where an introductory or a main narrative sets the stage either for a more emphasized second narrative or even for a set of shorter stories. So a frame can hold together more than one story. Okay, so it doesn't have to be just one additional story inside. You could have more than one. You can have a full chain of stories also. It is often told by the main character, but it can also be told by one of the supporting characters, even by the like one of the outsiders. And a character usually starts telling a story to other characters, or he could also sit down to write it, telling the details to the audience. So it could be in the form of a diary or a memoir of some kind. And then again, the perspective will shift back and forth in time. It can also be introduced covertly through symbolism, metaphor, or even allegory. And I'm going to explain allegory today. But this case where a frame is introduced covertly, we had last week with the House of Asterion, where we had very strong symbolism underlining the monologue coming from the first person, and the story was told by the main character. But as we said, it can be interpreted on more than one level. So the house is the symbolism, remember, for the world and for the universe, and also for this prison and life taken as a metaphor of prison and punishment, and then death taken as liberation, and so on. So the whole story is actually hugely allegoric, and this allegory serves as a frame for what we get in the actual textual narrative. So that's also a possibility. Okay, so that's the example that we had last week. Now, apart from symbolism, frame story can have a range of different functions, and the literary technique itself always uses embedded narratives, so the story within a story technique, which provide readers with a context about the main narrative. So frame always gives you some kind of an additional information about the levels of the text that you're supposed to be able to then reconstruct on your own. It also leads the readers from the first story to another one, so there are supposedly also links in the textual structure, which serve as like these little bridges that bridge the gaps between the stories and then put them together in like a whole structure. And it can also be a sort of a guidance that establishes the context for an embedded narrative, hopefully also helping the writer to create a context for interpreting it. Frames will also obviously offer multiple perspectives to the readers, and these multiple perspectives also give the readers more information about the characters, about what's going on with the characters regarding their intentions, thoughts, motivations, and so on. As I said, there are examples included here, but I'm just going to actually, although you might know some of them, I'm just going to move straight into this example number 4, since we are actually going to read and discuss Wuthering Heights next week. In Wuthering Heights, there is a frame story where the writer introduces Mr. Lockwood as the first narrator, and this is actually the case where one of the so-called outsider characters, so not one of the main characters, but the outsider, tells the story in the third person. And at the very, very beginning of the novel, as we're going to see next week, actually introduces this frame, provides a frame, and it's quite firm. It's also a very traditional technique in literary narration. So Mr. Lockwood depicts his first visit to the estate of the Wuthering Heights. And then the narration switches to the perspective of Mr. Dean, who describes the estate's history, and readers are introduced to all major characters subsequently. So it starts from the outside, it starts with the atmosphere and the setting. And you're going to see also that the setting is closely connected to the emotional and psychological state of the characters. So it's hugely important how the estate is described, and how the atmosphere actually contributes to the better understanding of what's going on this psychological level of the novel. So this kind of switching in narration in this particular case is extremely helpful because it connects the present with the past. So we'll see that in Wuthering Heights we have this constant shifting from the present moment to the past moment, because the story that's being retold by the narrator actually completely already happened, has already taken place. Mr. Lockwood tries to find out what could have happened in the past that made the current dwellers on the estate depressed and stubborn. Okay, and Mr. Dean, however, provides information about the past which caused the characters to transform this way. So you have like these two perspective shifts, framing what's being depicted and enrolling in front of us in the focus. In the focus story. So as I said, we are going to talk about that in more detail in the seminar class next week, and I'll be posting the text for you to read it in advance. Okay, moving into allegory, which I'm expecting most of you to be familiar with and to probably know it from earlier, from before, from some kind of a literary class, at least as a figure of speech. Okay, so we define it as a figure of speech in which abstract ideas and principles are described in terms of characters, figures, and events. And it's especially frequent in fables, where you have different animals standing from different symbolic principles, and often also being personified as people, so they talk and have emotions and generally behave like humans. Allegory can be employed both in prose and in poetry, with the purpose of teaching or explaining an idea or a principle. And it also frequently teaches some kind of a moral lesson. This is also especially frequent, again, in fables, where there is like this moral to the story in the end. So a story teaches you and illustrates an important principle, which is supposedly illustrated in the story that precedes the moral lesson that comes in the end. It also may promote some kind of additional layer that promotes an innovative view of a certain perspective or an idea or a moral principle, or has like a retouch on some traditional interpretation of one of all of those things. It's quite closely connected to symbolism, both in prose and in poetry. But whereas with symbolism, you usually have a straight line or a straight link, or a one-to-one correspondence between the symbol and whichever character or an idea in the story that a character stands from. An allegory is different because it actually introduces a complete narrative, which is symbolic. So in terms of textual structure, it's not an isolated idea or a character within the story. It's actually the whole story that takes place or enrolls in a format of a symbol. So an allegory is a complete narrative that involves characters and events that stand for an abstract idea or event, whereas a symbol is just a single object that stands for another object, giving it a particular meaning, usually within a story in some kind of a constant recurring manner. Also, unlike allegory, which, as we already said, is a full narrative, symbolism itself does not really tell a story. A symbol is just there to represent something within its structure. So, for example, in his allegory of cave, written by Plato, Plato tells the story of how some people are ignorant while at the same time other people see the light. And his allegory stands for an idea, which is also a leitmotif, which is recurrent, so repetitive in the story. So every time that you come across it, it symbolizes the same thing. So in that respect, it is static, and it's a representation which is recurrent in the story, but it's not a narrative, so it doesn't really tell the story. The functions of allegory in literary works are multiple. So writers may use them to add different layers of meaning to their works. It also makes the stories and characters multi-dimensional. This is especially important so that they can stand for something larger in meaning than what they literally represent, like we had with the House of Asterion. Allegory also allows writers to put forward their moral and political points of view without explicitly stating that in so many words. So a careful study of an allegorical piece of writing can give us an insight into the writer's mind. So usually these kinds of views, especially if the time or the moment of the literary work coming to life is maybe not so friendly to promoting certain ideas, they are given in a form of an allegory, so because they can be masked in that way. So a careful study then of the structure will, of course, reveal this as a kind of a deeper insight. And probably one of the most popular and also at the same time most famous examples of allegory in literature of all time is Animal Farm, written by George Orwell, that you probably read and know about. And it is really a political allegory which uses animals on a farm to describe the overthrow of the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, and also the communist revolution of Russia before World War I. So it's always taken as an example whenever you have a discussion of successfully employed allegory in literary works. So what happens in that particular novel is that the actions of the animals on the farm are actually used to expose the greed and the corruption of the revolution itself. And it also describes how powerful people can change the ideology of a society. And one of the cardinal rules on the farm is all animals are equal, but a few are more equal than others. And this thing also became a kind of moral to the story, which is often used on its own. So it's hugely intertextual because it's general knowledge and people usually know where it comes from and what it stands from. And it's a principle that is probably the best possible illustration of what happens to not just the revolution, but the democratic society once it gets distorted. And once that the certain subjects within a system become abusive and actually sort of pervert and corrupt the original principle. So the animals on the farm also represent different sections of Russian society after the revolution has taken place. So, for instance, the pigs represent those who came to power following the revolution, and Mr. Jones, the owner of the farm, represents the overthrown Tsar, Nicholas II, while Boxer, the horse, represents the laborer class. So you have specific characters standing up, representing specific levels of the classes actually that the characters speak for. And the use of allegory in the novel allows Orwell to make his position about the revolution clear. So you're very, very clear about the ideas that the author actually stands for and to expose its consequences. And can I just ask you briefly, do you know the novel? Have you read it? The Animal Farm? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully this background explanation is then making even more sense. Okay. Again, more examples. I'm just going to skip the second one, but you should go back and read it on your own. You can probably find more if you Google this a little bit. And I'm just going to move into the next figure or the next technique for textual structuring, and that's irony. And again, we are going to start from this basic definition where we define it as a literary device, and we say that, as just as in real life, that you probably know because you also use irony all the time. We say that this is a literary device where the chosen words are intentionally used to indicate a meaning other and often even opposite from the literal meaning or the intended meaning. It is also frequently mistaken for sarcasm, which is connected to it, and it's very as a technique, also as a literary figure, it's very similar to irony, but it's usually stronger and it's more vile, more hurtful, more explicit. So sarcasm is actually a form of verbal irony, but stronger and also frequently intentionally insulting. Okay, so it usually carries a stronger message than just irony itself. As an ironic or a satirical remark, It also can be viewed as a form of an ironic or sarcastic humor. And many people use it to say the opposite of what's true, to startle whoever is the other person in communication. And if it's the reader of a literary work, then it's there to like grip at the attention and startle the reader. And it's usually a format which is contextualized in such a way that the words used mean exactly the opposite of what is being said. And it's, as I said, frequently used also in real life communication. So, for example, if you see somebody struggling to open the door and you ask them, "Do you need help?" And they say something like, "No, thanks, I'm just enjoying the challenge," it's obvious that, this is them being sarcastic, because it's obvious that they need help. So if you ask them, "Do you need help in such a situation?" That's what you get, right, as a reaction or as a reply. It is also all about the context. If it's spoken up, especially, what's important is the tone of the voice, which is why it works better verbally. Sarcasm, both irony and sarcasm, but sarcasm especially, is connected to facial expression, intonation, body posture, and so on. But it can also be quite successfully done in the literature. Now, what is more important for us are these types of irony, which we are going to be frequently encountering in the works of literature that we read. And we also dealt with irony, listing the examples last week when we were reading The House of Asterion. So the types of irony are verbal, situational, and dramatic, where each one is defined on the slide here. So with verbal irony, we say that this is the use of words which mean something different from what they appear to me or to mean, or what you can read on the surface. With situational irony, there is a difference between what is expected to happen, like from the context, you follow the story and it builds up in a certain way, and it also builds up a certain expectations about how the rest of it is going to happen. But then something different and unexpected actually takes place. And then the dramatic irony is the case usually in the theater plays, where the story is happening in front of the audience, and the audience actually has more information about the context than the characters on stage. So this is the case where the audience is aware of what's happening, but the characters are not, right? So you see what's going to happen in the end, but the characters are unaware of it, and also act accordingly. As I said, it's especially successful and employed in the theater play, sometimes also in the movies, but the theaters work better, especially if the play is interactive, and then sometimes the audience even try to warn the characters that somebody is, I don't know, whatever, coming behind them or something like that. So like the audience has more info on the context than the characters. Also, when it comes to the functions of irony, like all other figures of speech, it brings about some added meaning to a situation, which can also just like with allegories be symbolic. You can have framing ironies also, and so it can have multiple functions. Irony always makes a work of literature more intriguing, and it also forces the readers to use their imagination to comprehend the underlying meanings of the text. Moreover, real life is also full of ironical expressions and situations. So just like metaphor, irony underlines a lot of intertextual um, encounters in dialogues and in readings and in communication. So the use of irony therefore brings a work of literature closer to real life, because that's something that people recognize and can identify with. Um, So verbal irony is always an intentional product of the speaker. So we do it on purpose, right? It doesn't just happen on its own. And it is always contradictory to his or her emotions and actions. And to define it simply, we say that it occurs when a character uses a statement with underlying meanings which are in contrast with the literal interpretation of the words or the text. And writers rely on the audience for discerning the hidden meanings they intend to convey. And, in communication, you also rely on the co-speaker to understand this additional intention that you're promoting when you're being ironic. Examples from the verbal irony in the literature, for example, include Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. So one of those examples is on the slide. So Juliet does not like the decision of her father to marry Paris, whom she dislikes, and instead adores Romeo. Hence, she makes a decision to marry Romeo and tells her mother about it, ironically, that whenever she would marry, it would be Romeo whom she, according to her words, dislikes and not Paris, thus confusing her mother. So I will not marry yet, and when I do, I swear it shall be Romeo, whom I hate, rather than Paris. So this is just verbal irony again. She's saying something, but intending in understanding there is something else understood in the underlining message. Also in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, it really abounds in examples of irony, like the whole novel. So we can find many examples of verbal irony in Pride and Prejudice, and there is just one also given here. So an ironic ring to Darcy's statement, she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. However, later we find out that the woman he found unsuitable to dance with ends up taking a place in his heart. So he actually falls in love with her, and so on. Again, one more example here in The Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. And also there is a list of let's say, real life short pictures, which are all examples of situational ironies. So things like a fire station burns down, which is unexpected because one would assume that the fire chief would keep his own building safe, or a marriage counselor files for divorce, or the police station gets robbed, a post on Facebook complaining how useless Facebook is, a traffic cop gets license suspended because of unpaid parking tickets, and so on. So this is something that writers use so frequently because it's hugely commonplace in both psychology and textual interference. So it's something that a writer can count on the audience to easily recognize and identify with. Examples of situational irony in literature, for example, there is a myth in Greek mythology about the fate of the Cronus, who believed in a prophecy that he would be overthrown by his children. So what he did was eat all of them. So he devoured any children that Rhea, his wife, actually had, that they had together. However, his wife tricked him with Zeus, giving Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead of the baby, and he believed that to actually be his dead son. But then Zeus later recruited his siblings, and they overthrew their father, which was unexpected for the Cronus himself, because he thought that he had outsmarted his fate and was actually wrong about it, because his son did take his place in the end. Or The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Situational irony again, where the character is in the middle of the ocean and he says, water, water everywhere, but not any drop to drink. So the sea water is all around, but the mariner is dying of thirst because he cannot drink the salty water. Again, a very strong example, a very strong picture of a situational irony. And finally, the last type that we are discussing is the so-called dramatic irony. And as we said, this is the case where like a twofold ironic story happens because the audience knows more about the story taking place than the character, which are the part of it. So it's an important stylistic device, which is commonly found in theater plays, but also in movies, sometimes also in poetry. And storytellers use this irony as a useful plot device for creating situations in which the audience knows more about the situations themselves that causes the causes of conflict and their resolutions before the leading characters or actors. And this is why readers observe that the speech of actors takes some kind of unusual meaning. For instance, the audience knows that a character is going to be murdered or will make a decision to commit suicide. However, one particular character or others may not be aware of these facts currently as the story is happening. Hence, the words and actions of characters would suggest a different meaning to the audience from what they indicate to the characters and the story. And this then creates intense suspense or even humor. And this speech device also emphasizes, embellishes, and conveys emotions and moods more effectively, and also includes the audience in the story more actively. When it comes to the functions, we say that many writers use this as an effective tool to sustain and excite the reader's interest, to grip again at the attention of the reader. And since this form of irony creates a contrast between situation of characters and the episodes that unfold, it generates curiosity, hopefully, if it's done successfully, of course. And by allowing the audience to know important facts ahead of the leading characters, dramatic irony puts the audience and readers above the characters and also encourages them to anticipate, hope, and fear the moment when a character would learn the truth behind events, the situations of the story that they already know. This type of irony also occurs in tragedies, where readers are led to sympathize with the leading characters. So it sort of stirs this emotional response of the audience. Thus, it emphasizes the fatality of incomplete understanding on honest and innocent people, and also demonstrates the painful consequences of the present misunderstandings present in the story, of course. And then one example of dramatic irony from literature would be Shakespeare's Macbeth, where this is again one of the most frequently quoted examples, the best examples of dramatic irony in the literature of all time, where Duncan says that he trusts Macbeth, not knowing about the prophecy of witches, that Macbeth is going to be the king and that he would actually kill him. So the audience, on the other hand, knows about this prophecy, so again, has more knowledge about the unfolding of the events than Duncan at that point in the play on stage. Okay, and then, another final example. Again, you may be able to look for more, search for more examples of this kind in some pieces of literature that you're already better familiar with, because it's very frequent. And I will also sort of encourage you to maybe, for our next discussion, think about some examples from maybe pop culture or from the books and the movies that you are familiar with. Dramatic irony is especially frequent in like horror movies. So it happens there all the time, both dramatic and situational. So either it is that you already know what's going to happen, or it's built on some kind of a rising suspicion. Also in detective plays, like in Agatha Christie's novels, also frequently employed there. So just think about the things that you may have encountered earlier, and I'll be giving you more examples of this in seminar classes. Okay, so I know that this at this point may sound a bit dry, so hopefully we will enhance on at least one point from the lecture every time in the seminar classes, so that they become clearer when they are illustrated with the actual text. Okay, so that's what I had for the lecture for today, and I'm just going to, I suggest that we take like a short, maybe 15-minute break. So I'm going to call group number 1 back in 15 minutes so that we can talk about crime and punishment. Is that okay?
All right.
Okay, so I'll see you again in 15 minutes.
Izvinite, profesorka, imam pitanje.
Da.
Da li bi, pošto ja sam u drugoj grupi, ali da li bi ja mogla sada u prvoj grupi slušati?
Naravno, apsolutno, to sam ja rekla na početku, budući da je ovo i onako tako neki raspored gde smo svi online i nekako ni ne komuniciramo dovoljno, ne morate mi se ni prijavljivati, meni je samo važno da ako možete budete prisutni na času u jednom od termina, meni apsolutno ništa ne menja, sad kad nismo u fizičkom prostoru, možete doći kad god vam, možete slušati čas kad god vam odgovara. Možete menjati grupe, kako god, samo je važno da ste prisustvovali u nekom terminu. Tako da, apsolutno da, možete.
Hvala vam.
Vidimo se onda, čujemo se ponovo za 15 minuta.